The desert wind carried the sound of distant gunfire as Navy SEAL medic Jake Morrison crouched behind a concrete barrier, his medical kit spread beside him. The small forward operating base in Afghanistan had been under attack for 3 hours, and casualties were mounting. His hands moved with practiced precision as he worked on a wounded soldier, the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like an old friend. "Medic, we need you over here!" The urgent call came from across the compound where smoke billowed from a damaged building. Jake quickly secured his current patient and grabbed his kit, sprinting through the chaos toward the voice that had summoned him. What he found made his breath catch in his throat. A female soldier lay pinned beneath a fallen beam, her desert camouflage torn and bloodied. Her face was pale but composed, and despite the obvious pain she was experiencing, her eyes remained alert and focused. She couldn't have been more than 25, with short auburn hair matted with dust and debris. "Ma'am, I'm going to get you out of here," Jake said, dropping to his knees beside her. As he began his initial assessment, he noticed something unusual about her calm demeanor. Most people in her situation would be panicking, screaming, or at least showing signs of shock. Instead, she watched him work with the steady gaze of someone who had seen combat before. "My name's Sarah," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Left leg's trapped pretty good. Can't feel much below the knee." Her matter-of-fact delivery struck Jake as oddly professional, almost clinical in its detachment. Jake worked quickly to stabilize her while calling for additional help to lift the beam. As he checked her vitals and began treating her wounds, he found himself studying her face more closely. Something about her features nagged at him, a sense of familiarity that he couldn't quite place. Her bone structure, the set of her jaw, the way she held herself even while injured, it all seemed somehow significant. "You're not with the regular unit stationed here," he observed, making conversation to keep her conscious and alert. "What's your assignment?" But Sarah's eyes had grown distant, as if she were looking through him rather than at him. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors filled the air, and Jake knew they would need to prepare her for medical evacuation soon. As he continued his work, fragments of memories began surfacing in his mind. Images from years ago, faces from his past that he had tried so hard to forget. The way Sarah moved her hands even while injured reminded him of someone he had known long before his military service began. The beam was finally lifted away, and Jake immediately saw the extent of her injuries. Her left leg was badly damaged, but it was treatable. What concerned him more was the way she seemed to be studying him now, as if she too was trying to place a half-remembered face. Their eyes met for a moment, and in that instant, Jake felt the ground shift beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with the ongoing battle. As the medical evacuation team arrived to transport Sarah to the field hospital, Jake found himself reluctant to let her go. There were questions forming in his mind that he couldn't yet articulate, connections his brain was trying to make that seemed impossible given the circumstances. He had treated hundreds of wounded soldiers over his years of service, but something about this encounter felt different, significant in a way that went beyond the usual bonds formed between medic and patient. The helicopter lifted off into the dusty afternoon sky, carrying Sarah away from the battlefield and toward medical care. Jake stood watching until it disappeared from view, his mind racing with fragments of memory and half-formed thoughts. He had the strangest feeling that this was not the end of their story, but rather the beginning of something he wasn't yet ready to understand. 3 days later, Jake found himself at the field hospital during his off-duty hours, ostensibly checking on patients he had treated. In reality, he couldn't stop thinking about Sarah and the nagging feeling that he knew her from somewhere. The hospital staff directed him to the recovery ward where she was being treated for her injuries. He found her sitting up in bed, her left leg elevated and wrapped in bandages. She was reading a book but looked up when he approached, offering a small smile of recognition. The natural light streaming through the tent windows illuminated her face more clearly than the chaos of the battlefield had allowed, and Jake felt that familiar tug of memory again. "I wanted to check on how you're recovering," he said, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "The doctors say you'll make a full recovery, which is good news." Sarah set her book aside and studied his face with the same intensity he had noticed on the battlefield. "You know, I keep thinking we've met before," she said slowly. "Not here, not in the military. Somewhere else, a long time ago. Jake's heart began to beat faster. "Where are you from originally?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the growing certainty that was building in his chest. "Small town in Ohio," she replied. "Place called Millbrook. Most people have never heard of it." She paused, watching his reaction carefully. "You look like you might have heard of it, though." The name hit Jake like a physical blow. Millbrook, Ohio. The town where he had spent the most important and most painful years of his childhood. The town he had left behind when he was 15, never expecting to hear its name again. Certainly not from the lips of a wounded soldier in an Afghan field hospital. "I lived there," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "From when I was 8 until I was 15. My family. We moved around a lot when I was young because of my dad's job, but those 7 years in Millbrook were the longest we stayed anywhere." Sarah's eyes widened, and her hand moved unconsciously to her throat. "What was your family name?" she asked, though Jake could see from her expression that she was already beginning to piece together the same puzzle that was forming in his mind. "Morrison," he said. "Jake Morrison. We lived on Elm Street, the blue house with the big oak tree in the front yard." As he spoke, he was studying every detail of her face, looking for confirmation of what seemed impossible. The silence that followed, stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Sarah's face had gone pale again, but this time it had nothing to do with her physical injuries. Her hands were trembling slightly as she reached for the water cup on her bedside table. "I was Sarah Patterson then," she said finally. "I lived 3 houses down from you on Elm Street, the yellow house with the rose bushes." Her voice carried a weight of emotion that made Jake's chest tighten with recognition, and something deeper, more complex. Suddenly, memories came flooding back with startling clarity. Sarah Patterson, the girl with pigtails who had been his constant companion during those formative years. They had walked to school together every morning, built forts in the woods behind their neighborhood, shared secrets and dreams under the old oak tree in his front yard. She had been his first real friend, and if he was being honest with himself, his first love in that innocent, overwhelming way that only children can experience. "You had a scar on your knee," Jake said suddenly, the memory surfacing unbidden. "From when you fell off your bike trying to keep up with me when we were racing to the creek." Sarah's hand moved to her right knee, a gesture so automatic it was clearly unconscious. "You taught me how to whistle," she replied, her voice soft with remembered affection. "I practiced for weeks until I could do it loud enough to call you from my bedroom window." The weight of the years between them seemed to press down on the small hospital tent. They were no longer the children who had made promises to write letters and stay in touch forever. They were adults who had lived entirely separate lives, who had chosen paths that had led them both to this moment in a war zone halfway around the world from where their story had begun. The revelation hung between them like morning mist, beautiful and fragile and somehow unreal. Jake found himself studying Sarah's face for traces of the girl he had known, while she seemed to be doing the same thing, searching for the boy who had been her closest friend in the features of the man who had saved her life. "I can't believe it's really you," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder and something that might have been grief. "After all these years in all the places in the world we could have ended up, we find each other here." Jake reached out instinctively and took her hand, the gesture feeling both completely natural and impossibly significant. Her fingers were calloused now from years of military service, but her touch still carried the same warmth he remembered from their childhood. "I looked for you," he said suddenly, the admission coming before he could stop himself. "When I was 18 before I enlisted, I drove back to Millbrook and went to your old house. The family who lived there said the Pattersons had moved away years earlier, but they didn't know where." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she squeezed his hand tighter. "We moved to California when I was 16, she explained. "My dad got transferred with his company. I wanted to find you too, but your house was empty, and none of the neighbors knew where your family had gone." She paused, wiping her eyes with her free hand. "I even tried looking you up online over the years, but Morrison is such a common name, and I didn't even know what state you might be in." The irony of their situation wasn't lost on either of them. They had both joined the military, both chosen paths of service that had brought them to the same remote corner of Afghanistan. How many times might they have been stationed at bases just miles apart without knowing it? How many operations might they have participated in that brought them within striking distance of each other? Tell me about your life, Jake said, settling back in his chair. I want to know everything that happened after you left Millbrook. What made you choose the Army? Sarah shifted in her bed, wincing slightly as her injured leg protested the movement. I was angry for a long time after we moved, she admitted. I felt like everything good in my life had been left behind in that little town. I acted out in high school, got into trouble. The military seemed like a way to channel all that energy into something positive. She went on to tell him about her training, her deployments, the friends she had made and lost along the way. As she spoke, Jake could see glimpses of the fierce, determined girl he had known, the one who had insisted on keeping up with him no matter how dangerous or difficult the adventure. What about you? She asked when she had finished her story. What happened to the boy who wanted to be a doctor? Jake smiled at the memory. He had indeed wanted to be a doctor when they were children, inspired partly by watching his mother care for his younger sister during a long illness. I became a medic instead, he said. The Navy gave me the training I needed, and I discovered I liked the challenge of emergency medicine. Plus, this way I get to help people and see the world at the same time. As they talked, other patients in the recovery ward began to take notice of their reunion. Word spread quickly through the small medical community that the SEAL medic and the injured soldier had turned out to be childhood friends. And soon they had an audience of curious medical staff and fellow patients. But Jake and Sarah were lost in their own world, trying to bridge the gap of years with shared memories and careful revelations about the people they had become. There was so much to say, so much time to account for, that the hours seemed to slip away without either of them noticing. It wasn't until a nurse came to check on Sarah's medication that Jake realized he had been sitting beside her bed for nearly 4 hours. The sun was setting outside the tent, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that reminded him powerfully of autumn afternoons in Ohio. I should let you rest, he said reluctantly, but Sarah caught his hand before he could stand. Promise me you'll come back tomorrow, she said, and there was something urgent in her voice that made him look at her more closely. I have something I need to tell you. Something I should have said years ago but never got the chance. Jake returned to the hospital the next morning with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that had kept him awake most of the night. Sarah's words about having something important to tell him had echoed in his mind, bringing back memories of their last day together in Millbrook all those years ago. He found her sitting by the window, dressed in clean fatigues and looking much stronger than she had the day before. Her leg was still bandaged, but she was able to move around with the help of crutches. When she saw him approaching, her face lit up with a smile that was purely the Sarah he remembered from their childhood. You look better, he said, settling into the chair that had become his usual spot beside her bed. The doctors must be happy with your progress. Sarah nodded, but he could see there was something else on her mind, something that was making her fidget with the edge of her blanket in a way that reminded him of how she used to act when she had a secret she was bursting to share. Jake, she began, then stopped, taking a deep breath as if gathering courage. Do you remember the day before your family moved away from Millbrook? We met at the oak tree in your front yard one last time. Of course he remembered. It was burned into his memory as one of the most painful moments of his adolescence. They had both cried, made promises to write every day, sworn that they would find each other again no matter what. He had wanted to tell her then how much she meant to him, but he had been 15 and terrified and unable to find the words. I remember, he said quietly. You gave me that lucky penny you always carried in your pocket. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her neck, where a thin chain disappeared beneath her shirt. I've been carrying something else since that day, she said. Something I never had the courage to give you. She reached behind her neck and unclasped the chain, pulling it out to reveal a small, tarnished silver locket. Jake's breath caught as he recognized it. He had helped her pick it out for her 13th birthday at the little jewelry store in downtown Millbrook. Open it, she said, placing the locket in his palm. With trembling fingers, Jake pressed the tiny clasp and watched as the locket fell open. Inside was a picture of the two of them from when they were about 12 years old, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. But on the other side was something that made his heart stop completely. It was a folded piece of paper so small it was barely larger than a postage stamp. Jake carefully unfolded it, and in Sarah's young handwriting, faded but still legible, were 4 words that changed everything. I love you, Jake. The silence that followed was profound. Jake stared at the tiny note, reading those 4 words over and over again, remembering the boy who had wanted so desperately to say the same thing, but had been too afraid of ruining their friendship. "I wrote that the night before you left," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was going to give it to you at the oak tree, but when the moment came, I couldn't do it. I was so scared that it would make our goodbye even harder than it already was." Jake looked up at her, seeing tears in her eyes that matched his own. "Sarah," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Let me finish," she said. "I've carried that note for 17 years through every relationship, every heartbreak, every lonely night in some foreign country. I told myself I kept it as a reminder of childhood innocence, but the truth is, I never stopped loving you. Not the memory of you, not the idea of you, but actually you." The hospital tent around them seemed to fade away as Jake processed her words. He thought about his own relationships over the years, how none of them had ever felt quite right, how there had always been something missing that he could never quite identify. Now he knew what it was. "I need to tell you something too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That lucky penny you gave me? I still carry it. It's been with me through 3 deployments, countless missions, more dangerous situations than I can count. And every time I touch it, I think about you and wonder what might have been different if I had been brave enough to tell you how I felt." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years of unspoken feelings settling between them. Outside, the sounds of the military base continued: helicopters, vehicles, the distant sound of training exercises. But inside the tent, time seemed suspended as 2 people who had found each other again tried to figure out what came next. "So what do we do now?" Sarah asked finally. "We're not children anymore. We have responsibilities, commitments, lives that are already complicated enough without adding this to the mix." Jake reached over and took her hands in both of his. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know that finding you again feels like the most important thing that's ever happened to me. Whatever we do, we're not losing each other again." Over the following weeks, as Sarah's leg healed and she prepared for medical leave, Jake found every excuse to visit her. What had started as brief medical check-ins evolved into long conversations that stretched late into the evening, with other patients and staff quietly giving them space as word of their extraordinary reunion spread throughout the base. They talked about everything and nothing, filling in the gaps of 17 years while rediscovering the easy companionship that had defined their childhood friendship. Sarah told him about her failed engagement to a fellow soldier who couldn't understand her need for adventure, while Jake shared stories of relationships that had ended because he could never fully commit to anyone, always feeling like he was waiting for something he couldn't name. "I think I was waiting for you," he admitted one evening as they sat outside the medical tent, watching the sun set over the Afghan mountains. "I know that sounds crazy, but I never stopped comparing everyone to the girl who used to race me to the creek behind Elm Street." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, a gesture that felt both new and familiar. "Not crazy at all," she said. "I did the same thing. Every guy I dated, I would think about whether you would like him, whether he made me laugh the way you did, whether he understood me the way you always seemed to." The reality of their situation was complicated in ways that went far beyond the romantic reunion of childhood sweethearts. They were both career military personnel with obligations and assignments that could separate them at any moment. Jake was a Navy SEAL with years left on his commitment, while Sarah was Army with her own specialized training and responsibilities. But more immediately, Sarah was being medically evacuated to Germany for additional surgery on her leg, and from there she would likely be sent back to the United States for extended rehabilitation. Their time together in Afghanistan was coming to an end, and neither of them knew when or if they would see each other again. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted on her last night at the field hospital. "Not of the surgery or the recovery, but of losing you again. What if this is all we get? What if finding each other was just some cosmic joke, and we're supposed to go back to our separate lives and pretend this never happened?" Jake had been wrestling with the same fears, but he had also been making plans. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "My current deployment ends in 4 months. I've already spoken to my commanding officer about taking leave when I get back stateside." He pulled out a piece of paper he had been carrying for days, working up the courage to show it to her. "I've been researching medical programs," he said. "There are several universities that would give me credit for my military medical training. I could finish my degree, maybe even go to medical school like I always wanted. Sarah looked at the paper, seeing applications and program information for schools scattered across the country. This is what you've always wanted, she said. But where would you go? These schools are everywhere. Jake smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile she had seen from him since they had found each other. That depends, he said. Where are you going to be doing your rehabilitation? The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and hope. Sarah had been dreading her departure, but suddenly she found herself thinking about it differently. Instead of an ending, maybe it was the beginning of something neither of them had dared to imagine. Walter Reed Medical Center, just outside Washington, D.C., she said. They have a specialized program for leg injuries like mine. I'll be there for at least 6 months, maybe longer. Jake's smile widened. George Washington University has an excellent pre-med program, he said. And they're very friendly to veterans. Plus, D.C. isn't that far from several good medical schools. The enormity of what he was suggesting began to sink in. Jake was talking about reorganizing his entire life, changing the trajectory of his career, all for the possibility of being near her while she recovered. It was romantic and terrifying and completely impractical. You can't make decisions like that based on me, Sarah protested, even as her heart leaped at the possibility. What if things don't work out between us? What if we're too different now? You'd be giving up everything you've built for yourself. Jake took her hands and looked directly into her eyes. Sarah, I've been drifting for years, going through the motions of a life that never felt quite real. Finding you again has reminded me what it feels like to have something worth fighting for. Even if things don't work out romantically between us, you're still my oldest friend, and I want to be there for your recovery. As they talked through the logistics and possibilities, both of them began to feel something they hadn't experienced in years. Hope for a future that included both adventure and stability, service and love, duty and personal happiness. The scared children who had said goodbye under an oak tree in Ohio were gone, replaced by adults who had the courage to choose each other despite the uncertainty ahead. 2 years later, Jake stood in the courtyard of Walter Reed Medical Center, adjusting his tie nervously as he waited for Sarah to emerge from the rehabilitation building. Today marked not only her official discharge from the medical program but also his graduation from George Washington University with a degree in biology and acceptance to Georgetown Medical School. The months of Sarah's recovery had been challenging, in ways neither of them had anticipated. There had been setbacks and complications, moments when Sarah wondered if she would ever regain full use of her leg, and times when Jake questioned whether he had made the right decision in leaving his military career. But through it all, they had supported each other with a devotion that surprised even them. Jake had spent countless hours at Sarah's bedside during the worst of her recovery, helping her through physical therapy sessions and celebrating small victories, like the first time she walked without assistance. Sarah, in turn, had helped him navigate the complexities of civilian college life, tutoring him in chemistry and biology when his military training hadn't fully prepared him for academic coursework. Their relationship had deepened slowly, built on the foundation of their childhood friendship, but strengthened by the shared experience of rebuilding their lives together. They had taken things carefully, aware that the intensity of their reunion and the stress of Sarah's recovery could complicate their feelings for each other. But as Jake watched Sarah walk through the doors of the medical center, moving with only the slightest limp that would likely fade with time, he knew with absolute certainty that every decision he had made had been the right one. She was wearing the same silver locket she had shown him in the field hospital, but now it held a new picture, one of them together at his graduation ceremony. Older and wiser, but still recognizably the children who had once promised to find each other again. "Ready to get out of here?" Sarah asked, linking her arm through his as they walked toward his car. "I never thought I'd be excited about leaving a hospital, but I can't wait to start the next phase of this adventure." Sarah had decided to pursue a career in veterans counseling, using her own experience with injury and recovery to help other soldiers transition back to civilian life. She had been accepted to a graduate program at Georgetown as well, which meant they would be able to continue supporting each other through their education. As they drove through the streets of Washington, D.C., Jake found himself thinking about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. From childhood sweethearts to strangers living separate lives, from a chance encounter on a battlefield to this new beginning in a city full of possibilities. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had found each other sooner? Sarah asked, as if reading his thoughts. If one of our internet searches had worked, or if we had run into each other at some point before Afghanistan? Jake considered the question as he navigated through traffic. I think about it sometimes, he admitted. But honestly, I don't think we were ready for each other before. We both needed to become the people we are now before we could make this work. Their military service had shaped them both in fundamental ways, giving them a sense of purpose and discipline that neither had possessed as teenagers. Jake's medical training had prepared him not just for his future career, but for the patience and dedication that Sarah's recovery had required. Sarah's own service had given her the strength and resilience to face her injury and rehabilitation with courage. That evening, they returned to the small apartment near the Georgetown campus that they had been sharing for the past 6 months. It was modest and practical, furnished with second-hand finds and military surplus, but it felt like home in a way that neither of their previous living situations ever had. As they settled on their couch with takeout Chinese food and started making plans for the next phase of their education, Jake pulled out a small velvet box that he had been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. "Sarah," he said, setting down his chopsticks and turning to face her fully, "I have something for you." She looked at the box with surprise and growing understanding. "Jake, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "I've been carrying something for 17 years too, just like you carried that note. Not a physical object, but a promise I made to myself under that oak tree the day I left Millbrook." He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, with a small diamond that caught the light from their living room lamp. "I promised myself that if I ever found you again, I wouldn't let fear keep me from telling you how I felt. I love you, Sarah Patterson. I loved you when we were children. I loved you when we were apart, and I love you now more than I ever thought possible." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the ring, then at the man who had somehow found his way back to her across years and continents and impossible odds. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes." Of course, yes. As Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, both of them thought about the children they had been and the adults they had become, about the winding path that had led them from a small town in Ohio to a battlefield in Afghanistan to this moment in their shared future. They had found each other again, not just as the people they had been, but as the people they were meant to become together.